Hello and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's review for Season 4 of Bojack Horseman. And this video is part of a series of videos where I continue to review every episode of Bojack Horseman one season at a time. In this video I will cover all the episodes of Season 4 of Bojack Horseman. So obviously spoilers, whatnot, blah blah blah. Anyway, so I talked about in previous videos how Season 3 was my least favorite season of Bojack Horseman, and when I watched Season 3 I changed my mind saying, actually this is pretty decent. Actually, I think most of the episodes I remember not being that good actually come from Season 4, so I think Season 4 will probably be my least favorite season of Bojack Horseman, and after watching Season 4 I can confirm that is probably the case. Now, that's not to say this is a bad season at all. In fact, it's a very good season. There's no such thing as a bad season of Bojack Horseman, but just as the one I was least interested in, and I think it's mostly just okay. It's like good, but not great. It doesn't really have some of the punch, the impact of some of the other seasons, and it's certainly not as funny. But it's decent. It's good. It's just, it was never my favorite. Now, when I first saw this season, when it first came out, I had just watched Bojack Horseman, the first 3 seasons, just before Season 4 came out. So Season 4 was the first season I watched when it first came out. Because my friends were trying to get me to watch, and a lot of other people I knew were trying to get me to watch this for years, and I finally gave in shortly before the season came out. And I remember when it came out, I wasn't really that interested in it. I talked to my friends, the ones who had recommended the show to me in the first place, and they agreed that it wasn't one of the better seasons, and we both kind of had the impression, or at least I mostly did, that the show was kind of losing its mojo. That it was kind of just getting a bit tired and kind of losing its edge. So when Season 5 was going to come out, I wasn't really that interested to watch it. I was like, oh sure, I'll watch it. It's a new episode, a new season of Bojack, but I wasn't like really excited for it because I thought, well, the show's kind of going downhill. But then I loved Season 5 and it became actually my favorite season of the whole show, which changed my attitude, and I think Season 6 also was really great as well. So I kind of look back on Season 4 as kind of the dip, the down point. Now, again, that's not to say it's a terrible season. It was funny because, as I said, this is kind of like a revelation, because for some reason I would throw all my ear at Season 3 before, because when I would think of Season 4, I think, oh, that's the season of Hollyhock. And I actually like Hollyhock. I thought she was an interesting character. I like her interactions with Bojack. And indeed, those are my favorite aspects of the season. But when I actually look at the season, Hollyhock isn't the whole thing. She doesn't comprise everything about it. And there's all this other stuff, like the election with Mr. Peanut Butters and Todd's clown dentist and other stuff like that, which I wasn't a fan of, and I didn't think was very good, and I thought it was quite bland and not very funny. So, I kind of forgot about all that. So anyway, let me just go ahead and get into the episodes of the season. Let's start with the first episode, Seeing Mr. Peanut Butter Run, which is not a very good episode. It was a poor way to start the season. This is something my friends who had watched the season before me warned me about, saying that the first episode's not that good. And indeed it's not. In fact, it is a trap many shows fall into, to have the first episode of the season focus on just one or a few characters and not all the main characters, particularly in this episode, which leaves out the character in which the freaking show is named after. Now, it's obvious to me why they did that. Is because they wanted to sort of leave you in suspense of what happened to Bojack. And in fact, they re-emphasized that he's been gone for years, so they kind of want to emphasize that he just disappeared first before they show where he actually went. And I don't know. I don't agree with that decision. I don't think it was the right thing to do. And I think I mean, I like Mr. Peanut Butter's all well and good. Like, I think he's really great as a supporting character, but when they focus on him too much, it doesn't really work out. And especially Todd, who was also the other focus. I've been very vocal that I'm not a fan of Todd. I don't really care for Todd. So, and this episode in particular was really, really over the top. I know it was trying to do, like, political satire, but honestly, like, I don't think it really did it that well, said anything new. I mean, yes, the show can do a lot of over-the-top ridiculous things, but usually it's, like, tempered, and it's not too over-the-top, and it's tempered with other character moments or other important messages or analogies within that ridiculous stuff that they did. But to me, this episode is just too over the top. I mean, deciding the governorship over a ski race, and then Mr. Peanut Butter's after issuing the ski race just casually is like, oh yeah, it's too bad I don't know how to ski. Which I know they're playing into how, I want to say stupid Mr. Peanut Butter is. I mean, it might be stupid. It's more oblivious and just cheerfully dumb, I guess. But that's too much for me. I mean, it just interferes with the comedy when it's just too over the top like that. And speaking of too over the top, the whole thing with the ski instructor being like, oh, throw out the skis and read these poems, and hang upside down and didn't actually teach him jack shit. Like, that whole sequence was dumb. I really didn't care for it at all. And then you had the whole thing with Todd and his drone throne and like having these kettle corns, and he just happens to fly in at the right second in order to become governor. That was all dumb. I really didn't like that. Now, there were some jokes that did land in this episode, and I did like the aspect of Diane, who was continuing writing all these messages to Bojack and sending all these voicemails that were not going answered. Like, that was an interesting aspect to me, but overall, I don't think this was a very good episode. Alright, so in my Season 3 review, I talked about a certain episode in which I didn't like that is considered a fan favorite that most people love and think is the best episode of the show, one of the best of the show. And in that talk, I talked about how there were 2 episodes in Season 4 in which I kind of felt the same way about, which I didn't really care for, and they are considered the best episodes of the show, and most people, critics and everything, love them to death. And one of those episodes in which I was referring to is this next episode, The Old Sugarman Place. Now, I gotta be honest, and I said the same thing about Fish Out of Water in Season 3, is that when I first was watching this season, I got maybe 5 or 10 minutes through this episode and I just skipped it. I'm like, this is boring, I don't like it, I'm skipping it. Now, later, I heard people refer to it as one of the best episodes. It was in the top 5, or at least the top 10 highest rated episodes on IMDb. So, earlier this year, when I was rewatching like Seasons 3 and 4, I watched this episode to the fullest because I don't think it was very fair of me to say it's not a good episode if I hadn't actually watched the whole thing, and particularly when there was a lot of people who loved this episode to death. So I watched it all the way through, and I still didn't really care for it. I thought it was kind of boring, and didn't really like it. So, on this rewatch, I tried to pay a lot more attention, and I did more than that after I watched the episode. I watched one of these, it was like a 30-40 minute review of a YouTuber who named this as his favorite episode of the entire show. And so he had a really deep dive into what made this episode so great. So I watched that, and it did give me a better appreciation, at least on what other people see in this episode and why they like it a lot. And it did make me appreciate the episode more than I had before. So I will no longer say it's a terrible episode. And I don't think it would make a top 10 worse, which I'm not doing. But if I did, I don't think it would make it Although it may just because there's so many great episodes of Bojack that it just might, because there's no bad episodes, it's hard to find episodes to put in the top 10 worst, which kind of makes the whole thing meaningless. But regardless, I appreciate this episode more, but I still don't think it's great. It's okay at best, in my opinion. Now, why? What is it that I have against this episode that so many other people love? And why was I turned off to it initially? Well, first of all, it just seemed... I just seemed very disconnected to the characters, and they seemed a bit cliche. Particularly the Fly character, whose name I can't recall at the top of my head. Let's see if I can look this up. But anyway, like, he felt like a cliche, and the story with him, Eddie, was that his name? Eddie, yeah. He felt like a cliche character, and the story with him where he was, helped Bojack rebuild the house, and at first they had an adversarial relationship because he said the house was an eyesore, and ended up becoming friends rebuilding the house. Like, that was a cliche story I didn't care for. And plus, like, the episodes seemed very nihilistic to me, like, that they spent all this time rebuilding the house, and then all of a sudden, and building this friendship, and at the end, Bojack just tears down the house and says, "Fuck you" to Eddie, and leaves. It kind of felt like, well, what was the point? Also, more than that, the side plot with the storyline taking place in the 40s, I really didn't care for, because I don't know, for me personally, I think it's kind of a pretentious concept to, the house has a story, because Bojack goes to hide out in this old family house, and as we see Bojack's story play out, we see the house's story play out with his ancestors and how there are parallels to it, and which some people love. Me personally, I just thought that was pretentious. Also, just my own personal taste, I don't really care for, like, the classic movie, like 40s, 50s movie style, which that storyline was very heavily emulating, particularly with the way that Bojack's grandmother talked. She was like, in the interactions she had with other people, was all snazzy and witty in that same sort of 40s way, which they'll do later on in season 6 with 2 reporter characters, which is another thing I just really hated. So someone on the writing staff obviously has a thing for these classical 40s movies, which I just don't care for that style, so that put me off of it right away as well. Now, how I appreciate the episode more after hearing what people had to say about it is because they talked about how this episode was a really strong metaphor for dealing with grief and the loss of a loved one. And how it sort of juxtaposed these 3 different characters who were all dealing with grief and loss of the loved one. Of course, it was focused on Bojack, with his grief of Sarah Lynn and him blaming himself for it. And then there's also, you got the 40 story of Bojack's grandmother, who's dealing with the loss of her son, Cracker Jack, and her sort of blaming herself for sending him off to war or letting him go. And then, of course, you have Eddie, the neighbor, who is dealing with the grief of the loss of his wife, which he blames himself because they flew too high and she got caught in a jet airplane where she wanted to turn back, I think, but he kept wanting to go higher, and she ended up dying, so he ended up blaming himself for it. So, in that way, I think I can see why people love this episode, because I do think that is a sort of powerful method. I guess I just don't really care for the way it was executed. For example, the character of Eddie, I never had any attachment to him whatsoever, because, as I said, I don't think he was developed very well. I didn't really buy his relationship with Bojack. Therefore, when they had the big reveal at the end that he, has sorrow over his wife's death, I didn't really feel what the episode wanted me to feel, because I had no connection to this character. It all felt like contrived writing, so I didn't go where the episode wanted me to go. And also, again, it's kind of a similar thing with the story of Bojack's grandmother, even though I do think the ending reveal of her getting lobotomized was very powerful. It does explain a lot of how Beatrice grew up to be so cold and uncaring, although I don't think it's any excuse, and I don't forgive her in the slightest, but I'll touch more on that later in the season. But I think it's interesting that it does explain it, although they were a bit on the nose with that, where the grandmother says to her, "Don't ever love anyone the way I love Cracker Jack." I'm like, come on, that's too on the nose. I'm sorry, I didn't care for that line. You didn't need it. It was obvious what they were getting at. But anyway, and also, yeah, the similar thing with the storyline in the 40s, I didn't really feel any connection to the character. I didn't really care. It doesn't seem like... I didn't really understand why we're being told this story other than the story of the house, which I thought was a stupid idea. And then you had like the scene where you had the Eddies playing like piano in town, and you have the scene where... Bojack's grandmother is singing at the same exact location, but 50, 60 years in the past, and they play it as if it's like a duet. I've heard others who love this episode, like the video I'm talking about, saying that there was a powerful, really dark, emotional thing that sort of really hit home the similarities between the characters. Me, and I know some people might not like me for saying this, I thought it was pretentious. I thought it was ridiculous. Personally, I don't like having, first of all, I don't really typically like having those song solos in the episode that kind of just mess up the flow of the episode. And the way they had it, played it with a duet through time, I thought was silly. I'm sorry. I didn't care for it. So, I can see why other people would like this episode, and I can see what they were going for. And part of it, I think it works. Like, for example, the scene where Bojack is watching the movie version of Sarah Lynn's death, where they have Paul Giamatti playing Bojack, which I think is funny how the first is Wallace Shawn playing Bojack, and now it's Paul Giamatti. Why do they always have these, chubby, balding actors, who are good actors, by the way, but they always have them playing Bojack with the horse costume on. But anyway, I thought the scene was powerful, where he was watching that, and they were sort of showing glimpses of Bojack's grandmother finding out Cracker Jack was dead, where you see the Paul Giamatti version of Bojack finding out Sarah Lynn was dead, and juxtaposing that. So I like that scene. But also another thing that bothered me is the whole fact that Bojack stayed in the house in the winter when there was no heat and he was freezing. Like, I don't know, that doesn't seem really practical to me. In practical terms, I don't think that's within Bojack's character to do that. He's used to his creature comforts or whatever, and I suppose it was trying to show how depressed he was, but I didn't really buy it. So, sorry to be a negative Nancy about this episode that a lot of people love. I still don't like it. I don't think it's terrible, as I said. I think it is decent, but it's not what I would call a good episode, and it's, to be absolutely fair, if I do any future rewatches of Bojack, this would be on my skip list. I just don't really take enjoyment out of this one. Anyway, sorry. Let me get into the next episode. And this is why I'm not doing a top 10 worst list, because I know it'll just piss everyone off. Anyway, let me get into the next episode, which is Hooray! Todd episode. Now, when I saw the title of this episode, I didn't exactly remember what happened in it, but the title is really off-putting because, as I said, I do not like Todd. And when I saw the intro, I remember this intro where it's like a orchestra type thing, and Todd shows up at the last second to hit the triangle, and everyone's like, "Ooh, who's this mysterious man? He's saved us, blah blah blah," and then building up as he's some sort of hero. I thought that was stupid. And they concluded with that, the episode with that as well, which I thought was really dumb. I thought that was so stupid. So when I first started watching this episode, I'm like, oh my god, I'm into it for a really terrible one. But the rest of the episode actually turned out pretty good. And I was actually surprised that they actually made Todd interesting in this episode. And the way you make Todd interesting is not make it too over the top. That's why I didn't like that orchestra thing, because I thought it was too ridiculous and over the top. But most of this episode is actually pretty grounded. With Todd like running around trying to do all these things for people. I mean, okay, he becomes a fashion model. That's not very grounded, but it doesn't take it too far to me, because it seems like the whole story with Hollyhock, like this is the first episode that really introduces Hollyhock, and that's why I really like it, because as I said, I like that character, and I thought it was funny the way she kept chloroforming Todd, and like she was pretending to be a maid but not doing any cleaning, so Todd had to do it all for her, while he was also busy running around trying to pretend to be Courtney Portnoy's fake husband or fake boyfriend, because she wanted to be seen with the commoner, and he ends up turning into a supermodel, and now she wants to be seen with a supermodel, which doesn't make any sense. And I love the running joke this season on the Todd's typical outfit becoming like a fashionable, because it's kind of making fun of fashion, especially the way when Todd shows up and Courtney's wearing the exact same clothes he is, and he's like, why are you wearing my clothes? She's like, oh, you silly, these aren't your clothes, this hat alone cost me $30,000. I was like, yeah, fuck the I really think the whole fashion industry is stupid, and I like this poking fun at it there. Yeah, so I did enjoy that. And yeah, and I just thought this was a pretty funny episode, so I was surprised I actually kind of liked it. Anyway, let me get into the next episode, which is Commence Fracking! Now, this gets back to the whole Mr. Peanut Butter running for governor thing, and this I actually did find kind of funny, because they tied it more into his personal relationship with Diane, about how she was completely against him fracking. He ended up supporting it just because Todd signed his name on a piece of paper, and so she publicly went out against him, and that caused her to write articles against him, and because of that he got challenged, like, would you do fracking in your own backyard? He's like, sure. So, oh, we have someone in your backyard ready to start for, like, that whole thing is ridiculous, but it is funny. It is sort of like hammering home the whole thing about how politicians don't really mean what they say, and when they're called out on their bullshit, they kind of like collapse to it. And the whole thing with Diane and Mr. Peanut Butter's kind of it's really interesting how they showed like the downward spiral of their relationship. I mean, this really portrays the relationship in their last life is the only way they can have sex or have a connection with each other is through arguing over shit, which is very unhealthy. But anyway, bigger thing about this episode is this is the first episode where we see Bojack and Hollyhock really interact after Hollyhock reveals that she thinks that Bojack is her father, or knows, with quotation mark, that he's her father. But and it was really funny. Like, I thought it was hilarious, the scenes of them trying to find her mother, and Bojack kept saying all these disgusting things about women he slept with and never talked to ever again. Like, they had this whole running joke about how he, when a woman he slept with, it's like, oh, I tried to call the number you gave me, but it was a sandwich shop in Toledo or something. And they actually tie this back later on towards the end of the series with the father also, Crackerjack, when he first slept with his mother, she tried to get a hold of him, and it's like, I tried to call the number you gave, but it was a pizza parlor. And it's kind of, it makes a statement though on how how those who are abused by their parents or have abusive or neglectful parents will in some ways turn out like them, which is a huge theme of this season, and so I thought that was funny too. But I just really liked the whole interaction between Bojack and Hollyhock here, and how Bojack is really coming to care for her, and how after she ran away from him because she was being such a dick, he just couldn't let it go, and really did find that he cared for her. So anyway, let's get into the next episode, which is Thoughts and Prayers, which I think I don't know. I think that's a funny title. I like the premise of this episode is that they're trying to do this movie Mistaken with Courtney Portnoy, which has a lot of violence, but then there's all these mass shootings, and whenever there's a mass shooting, they decide it's not proper to release the movie at this time. And it's funny because I thought of this episode when season 1 of The Punisher was supposed to come out like after this episode aired, and it was delayed because there was a mass shooting. And so when that happened, that made me think of this episode. It's like, oh, that's stupid. Like, I'm not going to get into too much into my political stance, but I am very, very pro gun regulations. Not banning guns, which is two different things. It's the old straw man, which I'm so sick of hearing. But gun regulations, regulations in America are redonkulously lax. But even so therefore I do think, mass shootings is a huge deal that needs to be addressed. And even so, though, I thought delaying a TV show over it was ridiculous. But then when I actually watched The Punisher, they had an episode that was actively speaking out against gun, firearm regulation, gun regulation activists, and painting them with these stupid strawmans. And so when I saw that episode, I was like, okay, now I can see why they delayed The Punisher, and perhaps they should have, because it wasn't appropriate to have this that was actually attacking what we need to stop these mass shootings in that show. So, okay, that was a different thing. But this episode dealt more with just violence in general. And I personally, again, I guess I'm getting more into my politics, but I personally always found, and this is sort of an educated opinion because it's something I studied in school, the way media affects society, is that I've always found that those who are against gun regulations, which is really pretty much every other developed country in the world has proved that it works, when those who are against them, they use stuff like violent movies, violent video games as distractions, as fodder, saying, oh, that's really what has to do with this. It's nothing to do with gun regulation, which is a load of hooey. It's a load of bullshit. All these other countries, as I mentioned, proved it because they have all the same violent media and the same sort of movies, video games are just as prevalent, if not more so, and yet a lot less gun violence has more to do with gun laws. Who would have thunk it? And so they often use the phrase thoughts and prayers as a way to deflect, as a way to not talk about the issue, as a way to just pretend that they care about what just happened when they don't really care. And I see that more in politics. There's a lot of memes and stuff that make fun of that phrase. In fact, whenever I hear that phrase after a mass shooting, it actively pisses me the fuck off. But in this episode, they use it more as a way to be dismissive of to make it pretend like they care about the mass shootings when really they don't. In fact, they have a lot of jokes in this episode about how these movie producers feel like they're the victims. Oh no, or the movie star Courtney Portnoy. Oh my God, I'm so affected by this mass shooting because my movie got canceled. Like, I like that commentary. That is funny how stuck up these executives could be, but. On the other hand, I don't think it's realistic because, as I said, even that case with The Punisher, it was only delayed by a month, and I don't think they ever actually cancel a movie because of a mass shooting. They might push it back a couple weeks or whatever, but so in that aspect, I don't think this is that realistic. And there's this movie that was about terrorism on an airplane. It was like a comedy making fun of it, and it was supposed to come out in September of 2001. And of course, that was pushed back for over a year because of 9/11, but it still eventually happened. Although it was actually pushed under the rug. It was supposed to have a big release, but it was kind of straight to DVD sort of. So it did kind of damage it. But that's about the only example I can think of where something like that happened. I can't think of any examples with mass shootings. So I didn't find that realistic. But I did sort of like the commentary about how they use that term thoughts and prayers to act like they care when really they don't. But anyway, the rest of the episode dealing with Bojack and Hollyhock, I loved. I absolutely loved. I thought it was pretty great because because it had to do with her, Hollyhock wanting to see her grandmother, wanting to see Bojack's mother Beatrice, and they go to the nursing home, and Bojack finds out she has dementia, and he's still like really, really rotten to her. Now it's funny because if you watch this episode out of context, it may seem like Bojack is the biggest asshole who walked the earth, but if you think of the context and how Bojack's mother treated him, like repeatedly said he was worthless, and told him when he was a child, which I think is very important, because children are so dependent on their parents. That's how they see the world. They're meant to be the guardians, their lovers, their teachers, those who really nurture them. And throughout Bojack's entire life, he was told, it's your fault I'm miserable for being born. It's your fault. Repeatedly, and repeatedly. And of course, I'll get more into this towards the end of the season, which touches on this more. But in that aspect of it, I'm sorry, but I totally see Bojack's point of view here, being a total asshole to his mother. And I love that one aspect of when, like, she couldn't recognize him, kept calling him Henrietta or Harrietta, which really pissed him off. And he came up with this plan to make her recognize him as Bojack, because she recognized Bojack from horsing around. So it's like, oh, let's put on a horsing around play, and that way she'll recognize me, know who I am. And when he was talking, explaining this to Hollyhock, he's like, and then I'll take her hand, I'll look her in the eye, and I'll say, fuck you! I think that is one of the most hilarious moments, or best moments of the entire show. Absolutely loved that. And of course, he went more on a rant about how he degrade her and tell her she's fucking worthless. And again, I'm not sure I would side with him exactly and say that's a good thing, but I completely understand his point of view. Like, I am totally with Bojack in this case, even though I feel like the episode's trying to tell us he's meant to be the asshole, and we're meant to see Hollyhock's perspective where she's just appalled. But I think, like, again, I think it's completely unforgivable the way she, not just as a child, but throughout his entire life. We saw even in the present timeline of season 1, she was still treating him like shit. So she was never, in any sense of the term, caring to him in the least. Which, of course, towards the end of the season, they explain more of why this is, but I don't think that in the slightest bit excuses it. Not in the slightest. So I think Bojack's completely justified. But anyway. Alright, let's get into the next episode, which is Stupid Piece of Shit. And this is another fan favorite, but this isn't one where I'm going to say, oh, I hated it or skipped it or anything like that. It's fine. I liked it, but I never singled it out. Whoa, this episode's one of the best, or it's amazing. I was just like, yeah, it's another good episode. I do like the framing device of this episode, where we actually hear Bojack's inner thoughts, and he's constantly saying, "Oh, you're a stupid piece of shit." While you do that, I think that was cool. I think the animation that they had, where whenever they had those inner thoughts, that was funny. That was a cool device. I do think this was I did like that use of the episode. But yeah, I mean, other than that, I didn't think it really stood out as something that absolutely amazing. I did like the storyline with Bojack and Hollyhock and them taking Beatrice home, and Beatrice having this attachment to the baby, and so Hollyhock got a doll. Which apparently in the writer's room, that was based off of someone's personal experience in real life with someone with dementia, that they had this attachment to this doll that they thought was a baby. But then, of course, they put the Bojack spin on it, where Bojack felt disgusted that she was treating this doll like very lovingly, and yet treated him like shit for his entire life, as I talked about, for his entire life. So he got rightfully spiteful and was being a dick and threw the doll out the window. And of course she screamed in terror because she thought that that was an actual baby that he was throwing out the window. So that was a really fucked up thing to do, and of course I would be wise not to defend Bojack for doing that, but I, again, kind of side with him. I mean, maybe, okay, he shouldn't have gone that far. That was an asshole's thing to do, but I can see where he's coming from. I'm sorry. But it also dealt with, of course, his relationship to Hollyhock and how he kept hiding from her because he didn't want to deal with her, or particularly Beatrice, and so he'd go out to a bar. And it was actually a funny running joke where he kept going out. Whenever he went out to run an errand, he'd end up drinking all day at a bar, and then he'd go to Mr. Peanut Butter for help, but he was drunk out of his mind, and he hadn't seen Mr. Peanut Butter in over a year and whatever, but he tried to be helpful, but wasn't really that helpful. And how Hollyhock was kind of getting a bit fed up with the Bojack's behavior, which I also think is understandable. But I do love the coda at the end where they bring it all together, where Hollyhock talks about like an inner voice that always tells her that she's worthless, and saying, oh, that's just a stupid teenage girl thing, right? I'll grow out of that. And Bojack's like, yeah, of course. Which is great. I like that because obviously, as we've seen throughout this episode, no, it's not something you can grow out of. And particularly from his perspective, it definitely wouldn't be. But he wants to spare her. Like, he wants to be kind to her. He wants her to feel good in this moment. And this is why I think, like, you get a lot of glimmers throughout the season that Bojack actually is trying to be a good father to her. Even though he does do and say a lot of shitty things, you see the intention is there, and that he does actually do some really great caring things, which really, in my mind, really sets him apart from Beatrice, who was just completely, utterly worthless and cruel. But anyway, you also get the storyline of the Todd sham wedding and how Princess Caroline kept trying to push it on him with rutabaga and everything, and it ended up backfiring, and she ended up getting fired, and because when Todd decided not to do it, whatever. That's kind of brought the episode down to me. Not that it was terrible or anything, but yeah, I mean, that wasn't too great. Let's get into the next episode, Underground. Now, I talked about in season 3 how there's a couple episodes I saw which I did not remember at all, which I'm sure I hadn't seen. There was a couple in season 4 like that too, and this was definitely one of them. I definitely did not see this episode the first time I watched it. I think I must have fallen asleep while I was binging it and kind of skipped it by accident or something like that, because I went earlier this year when I rewatched season 4, I watched this episode and I had zero memory of it whatsoever. I'm 100% certain I had never seen this episode before. And that kind of like, because I saw the finale of Bojack, or the penultimate episode, I should say, of the entire show that brought Zach Braff back, and I totally didn't get that reference. I had no idea why the hell he was there in that sequence, because I didn't see this episode. So this episode is, I think, is another example of being way too over the top. Like, it is a bit too ridiculous for me. I'm sorry. Like, the house falling underground, and then resorting to, like, lighting themselves on fire, and, like, Princess Caroline and Todd going off with these ant people, like, that whole thing. It's just too much for me. It's just way too over the top. But I like it better than the first episode, and I'm willing to forgive it in some regards, because it is actually really funny. I do like the the scenes, the political satire they have here between Woodchuck and Mr. Peanut Butter. I think they're going for an obvious, like, 2016 election vibe here with Trump and Hillary Clinton, where someone is completely intelligent and reasonable, and the other person's like, yeah, and just saying the stupid shit everyone wants to hear, and so they go along with him. And they eventually, like, tie up. And then, of course, they eventually turn on Mr. Peanut Butters and decide to follow fire as their god, which is a bit ridiculous. And, of course, they'll continue this election sort of satire theme where they have... I can't remember her name, but Mr. Peanut Butter's first ex-wife, where she turns out where she was just using this dumb idiot Mr. Peanut Butters in order for all these rich, corporations to get whatever the fuck they want and do all these horrible things, which also could be an analogy for George W. Bush for that matter. But anyway, so I appreciate that side of it, and I think there were a lot of funny moments. With the Mr. Peanut Butter's storyline, the whole Todd, Princess Carolyn thing with the ants was just stupid. But I was a bit disappointed because this is the first episode that actually showed Bojack and Diane meeting up after the year he'd been gone, and it was built up to so much with all the messages and letters and whatnot that Diane was leaving Bojack, but they didn't resolve it in a satisfying way. Like, at first she was like, I don't want to talk to you, whatever, blah blah, but then they end up getting drunk, and I do like some of those scenes, like where they're getting drunk and Diane was wallowing and whatever, but I think they could have done more with it. They could have, like season 1, for example, season 2, I'm sorry, the end of season 2 where Diane was like loafing and Bojack's house and drinking, like those, I think was great. I think they could have done something more like that where they connected with each other, but instead, so it didn't go far enough, in my opinion. So overall, I think this episode decent. It's fine. I mean, the over-the-topness did make me not want to like it and actually call it a bad episode, but there was too many funny jokes and some character bits that work, so I had to admit it's a decent episode. Anyway, we'll get into the next episode, which is The Judge, and this is another episode I'm actually not as certain I hadn't seen this before, because some things about this episode seem vaguely familiar to me, such as maybe this is an episode I was falling in and out of sleep of as I was watching it, because some things seemed very vaguely familiar to me, such as the Hollyhock, falling for this intern who ends up treating her like shit, and Bojack trying to hatch schemes to prove that he's no good, and eventually just realizing that he should let Hollyhock do what she wants and telling her she's a great person. But the main plot about Bojack being a judge at the booty judging show, when that Sir Mix-a-Lot kept saying, "I cannot lie, that is what I'm known for." But anyway, I don't have any memory of that whatsoever. So, I don't know. Maybe I did see this episode and that part was just forgettable to me, or maybe I just only saw parts of the episode. I don't know. But this is another episode I watched, when I did my rewatch earlier this year. So, yeah. I mean, and they also had the storyline with Princess Caroline going to meet Ralph. I never really was into Princess Caroline and Ralph's relationship, which is why I hadn't mentioned it so far. I don't know. It didn't seem that interesting. It wasn't really funny. And this storyline where they go to the family's house and they're all mocking cats and putting on cat ears and making fun of the cats. So, I didn't care. I really didn't. I had no attachment to that whatsoever. But I do like the scenes with Bojack and Hollyhock and how he was trying to sabotage her. It was kind of funny how he offered to advance a contestant. She slept with the PA, but the guy that Hollyhock was seeing was actually the intern, not the PA, so she slept with the wrong person. He's like, "I didn't tell you to sleep with him, I said seduce him." She's like, "Isn't that the same thing?" Oh god, it's pretty funny. So it was a decent episode again. I mean, I don't think it's great or anything, but it's okay. So, next episode after that is Ruthie. And this episode I do very clearly remember. And I think All right, let's just tackle the elephant in the room. Let's get the main thing out of the way. The framing device where they have like Princess Caroline's great-great-granddaughter or whatever, it's telling the story in the future about her great-great-grandmother and her day and all that. And at the end of the episode, you find out that it's actually all bullshit. It's something that Princess Caroline imagines to make herself feel better. I really hated that. I know it's supposed to like have an impact. It's supposed to be this like profound fake out because, of course, the whole episode's about Princess Caroline trying to have a baby, but then they have a miscarriage. But you're thinking the whole time, well, she must have had a baby eventually if she has this great-great-granddaughter. But then you find out that's just a fake out because she doesn't really have the great-great-granddaughter. She just imagined that, which I think that's stupid. That actually really pissed me off. I don't know why. I mean, you may disagree, whatever, but I thought that was dumb. But you know, again, this episode's okay. I think the storyline of Princess Caroline was an interesting through storyline of her like dealing with all this, you know, the miscarriage and the awfulness. Like, this is the one point where I did actually like her relationship with what's his face, the mouse guy. But this is also the episode in which they broke up, and because she just she was frustrated and didn't want to tell him, and he felt like he kept lying to her. And also she fired Judah, loyal Judah, because she found out about this thing, and it was just one bad thing after another. So that character story made me think, okay, this episode was decent. It wasn't terrible, but it's still not good. And then the storyline with Bojack and Diane going into the courthouse, standing in line forever, like, I don't know. That's kind of throwaway to me. So this episode's, again, it's fine, whatever. Next episode is Loving That Cali Lifestyle. Now, I will say, like, I would have actually really highly elevated this episode and say it was one of the better episodes of the season. The Bojack storyline is what I remember most from the season. But unfortunately, the episode also focuses on Todd and his clown dentist, which I hate this storyline. When I talk about how I don't like Todd, I am specifically referring to storylines like this, which I think are so dumb, not funny in the least. Although, and this has to do with the previous episode as well, I guess, the Ruthie, and even the one before that too. I think they also dealt with Todd's clown dentist, the judge one. But I will admit, like, I did like that scene where the clowns were getting together to get Princess Caroline into place in order to pitch her TV show, and they kept like squirting her and doing the honka honka. But it was still ridiculous. I kind of liked it, but it's still stupid. Like, I don't know. I was more interested in the Princess Caroline aspect of that storyline of her trying to pitch this show of Filbert, which, after watching season 5 and knowing how important that show will become, it's very interesting. It's funny because when I first watched season 5, I didn't remember this stuff at all until I went back and rewatched season 4. And Filbert, of course, was the name that she was going to name her child, her son, that never got born. And so that's why she personally felt attached to it. And of course, the whole joke about what the difference between an agent and a manager is, which they all constantly joke, there's no difference except a manager can produce, and she finally wants to do that. She wants to produce something, and she's latched onto this because it has the name of the child, and so she is about her getting together to pitch it. And when she finally does, the pitch is successful, but Turtletop insists that she has to have Bojack attached, so she forges his name and feels really bad about it, and tries to call. Now, the Bojack storyline, of course, is great because this had to deal with Hollyhock being drugged, and this is when Hollyhock has to go to the hospital, and her fathers fly out and take her away and say that Bojack can never see her again, which is very devastating for him. And he, of course, finds out that it was his mother, Beatrice, that was drugging her this entire time with the show. It's like a fat reducing thing, but it was actually drugging her. It was amphetamines. and putting and slipping in her coffee. And you watch earlier parts of the season, they did drop all these hints about how she kept making her coffee, and she's like, "Ooh, this is good coffee," whatever. Which again, I like that continuity to it because it was building up to this, where they find out that she was actually drugging her the whole time. Now you do find out in the next episode that Beatrice had a thing with her parents about telling her about always making fun of her for being fat and making her feel like shit, and so that she had this psychological thing of trying to make sure that Hollyhock wasn't fat, and that actually led to her being drugged or whatnot, and they blame Bojack for it. But again, I don't see that as an excuse. So when Bojack was absolutely furious with his mother for ruining the one relationship he had with his daughter, and took her to this facility, and was like, "I want you said you wanted our first available room." It's like, "No, I said your worst available room." Again, I agree with Bojack. I was just as angry with Bojack, and maybe that's unfair, and other people might totally disagree and say that she has dementia. You can't really blame her. But dementia or not, like, she had, again, when she didn't have dementia, she had the record of ruining Bojack's life, of treating him like shit constantly, and now, I don't know, and the fact that she refused to acknowledge who he is. Now, again, that's her dementia, it's not her fault, but still, I can see how that's frustrating for Bojack, and I think Bojack is 100% justified in being as angry as he is, and just wanting to get rid of her and dump her off and never see her again. Which may seem horrible. Some people's like, that's horrible. That's his mother, and she's gonna die, and she has dementia. She's in a really hard time. But she was a really horrible figure to that life. I mean, alright, let me put into the context of this. What if there was the character of Bojack was a woman, and it was the father who was dying, and the father sexually abused her as a child? Like, you wouldn't say, "Oh, she should still be forgiving to him and still be loving to him." You'd probably be like, "No, fuck that guy. Yeah, sitting in the place to rot." And I think it's the same kind of logic, even though, okay, granted, being sexually abusive is worse than what she did to him, but still, it's abusive. She was very abusive. She was like, for a child to continually tell him that he's worthless and you're the one who ruined my life, that completely scarred him for life. And that was really what made him, all the entire show is about all his inner issues, all his inner demons, which we touched on earlier with the stupid piece of shit episode. That had to do with, that was because of his mother, because of the way she treated him. So in that sense, yeah, I think, fuck her, send her in a place to rot forever. So yeah, I thought this was a pretty powerful episode. Alright, so let's get to the next episode, which is Time's Arrow, and yes, this is the other episode in which I was referring to that I did not like, that everyone else loves to death. Now, to be fair, with this episode, I actually did change my mind. I actually do like this episode now, maybe not as much, still don't like it as much as everyone else does, but I actually do think it's a good episode now, but when I first saw it, I didn't like it at all. In fact, this is yet another episode where I got like 5 minutes through and I'm like, this sucks, and skipped it. Which you might think, like, wow, didn't you miss up in the whole explanation of Beatrice's backstory and how I kind of got the gist of it, like, through other things, and I just didn't care. Like, just for me, nothing excuses her behavior and the way she treated Bojack. Now, and also, like as I said, it gets back to the whole 1940s storyline or whatever. Of course, they go through the 50s and 60s in this episode, but still, I was like, I'm just not interested in it. Now, again, I've heard so many people talk about this episode and say it was the best thing ever, and this is another episode. I think this is in the top 3 of the best episodes of Bojack Horseman on IMDb, and a lot of other people say it's one of the best episodes. So I was like, okay, I need to watch the whole thing, need to give it a shot. So earlier this year I watched the whole thing. I was like, okay, this episode's actually not too bad, but I still don't really like it. So I watched it again. Again, I watched another review that explained just how brilliant this episode is, and I watched it again, tried to be more forgiving, and okay, I am turning around on this episode and thinking it is actually definitely better than what I gave it credit for when I first saw it. Unlike Fish Out of Water, which I think is just as terrible as when I skipped over it the first time. But with this episode, okay, I can see how I actually did need to give it a chance. And probably part of the reason why I skipped over is because I skipped over the Sugarman Place episode, which set up for this one. So it was just more of, not this crap again. But I do think it's interesting, and I just watched this video that explained like that the writer's Raphael Waxberg, whatever his name is, it was inspired by his poem, and in turn the poem was kind of also inspired by this work about how, and there's a famous novel called Time Zero that was all about how showing how your upbringing and can affect, like, your grandparents' upbringing affects your parents' upbringing, which affects your upbringing, which affects how you are today, which is pretty much what this episode's about. And I do appreciate that. I do think that that is a very interesting aspect. Now, I keep saying throughout this review that there's no excuse for Beatrice, what Beatrice does. And to be fair, to be completely fair, I don't think the show itself is trying to excuse her behavior, just illustrate the patterns of behavior and how it's sort of handed down. And it's just not as simple as Beatrice is a terrible person, that there's more backstory and more reason of how she ended up the person that she ended up being, and how the person she ended up being ended up affecting Bojack from an early age, and he ended up being the person he ended up being. I think the show is intending to leave it up to the audience to determine, or to ask themselves whether or not they think this terrible upbringing excuses their behavior. And I'm talking about both Beatrice and Bojack, because Bojack, let's be fair, is also a terrible person, which you'll get more into in later seasons. But, and so when I say this, I'm saying it as my own personal interpretation, because the show is letting me interpret, or letting you and letting everyone interpret it as they like through their own personal lens. My personal interpretation is that Bojack is, even though he is a terrible person and he does some terrible things, that he is at heart, he does also do some great things. Whereas Beatrice is, I don't see any positive in her whatsoever. And I think her upbringing, as terrible as it is, really doesn't excuse her the way she acted as a mother, and that she had purposely damaged Bojack and was just perpetuating. She's basically perpetuating the cycle of abuse. Whereas with Bojack, there's a lot of glimmer in instances, which we'll see more in the next episode, where he actively tries to fight that cycle. Now, we do see that sometimes, as I mentioned earlier before, that Bojack does repeat the cycle, such as, the father saying, giving out the number that's just a pizza parlor, and some place where Bojack does the exact same thing, where he hands out a number that's just a sandwich shop in Tuscaloosa or whatever. But not always. He does do other things that try to fight that cycle, such as going out of his way to find Hollyhock's mother, and going out and trying his hardest to treat her like a loving father. In fact, because I feel like he's getting a bad rap because he got blamed for her drug overdose, which he actually had nothing to do with. That was, again, Beatrice's fault, even though you say, she just had dementia, it's not her fault. But I think it's inherent to the terrible person that she is. And she, unlike Bojack, does not try to fight this cycle at all, and in fact just makes it worse. And it was really shitty the way that she was treated at a young age, and the way that women were discriminated against, and the way that she was told repeatedly by her father to not show emotions. In fact, saw what happened to her mother when she did dare to show emotions, and that's what caused her to become so emotional. So again, it's understandable. But then again, like, you could say a lot of serial killers or Hitler people in real life also had terrible upbringings. A lot of these serial killers were abused and whatnot. Does that excuse them becoming serial killers? Does it excuse them of the atrocities they committed? No, it does not. And I think the same thing applies to Beatrice. Whereas with Bojack, I think it does kind of excuse it just a little bit, not completely, not 100%. Like, I think he does bear some responsibility for some of the terrible things he's done. But it's not just because he's the main character that I excuse him more. It's because we see that he means well and he wants to do well and that he does do well sometimes, that I think excuses him more than Beatrice. But anyway, getting to this episode in particular, okay, so they talked about how this was sort of an inspiration for them to do the show Undone, which is they have one season of Undone so far, which I thought was an amazing show. I loved it, and this was their inspiration of like playing with linear time and playing with time and shit, which I think personally was done much better in Undone than it was in this episode, because they say, ooh, you know, a lot of people think this episode is revolutionary because it kind of tries to see through the eyes of someone with dementia, and they did in fact do a lot of research about dementia to make this episode, so it is at least somewhat effective in portraying that. But the thing is that it's still mostly linear. Like, I do like the way it does fuck around with time and things, and it does weird things like the fact that Henrietta always has like a black blur on her face, and how some people in her memories have like blank faces and stuff, and how things urge blink in and out, like when Butterscotch at one point shows up and it's like, I'm coming to you hat in hand. He didn't have a hat in his hand, but as soon as he said that, a hat appears in his hand. Like, that kind of method of storytelling I actually did like. There was an aspect of this episode I did really appreciate, but it was still told in a linear fashion, so I don't think they really did completely tell it from the perspective of someone of dementia, because if it was, it would have been more non-linear, the way, say, something like Undone was, which is why I appreciate Undone a lot more, because that they really fuck with linear time, where here they kind of do, but I don't think they go far enough, personally. And you might say, well, they would be more confusing, but it would also be more artistic and more true to life if the point is to portray someone who has dementia's viewpoint. Like, it would not be this linear for someone who had dementia. So they do kind of sacrifice that artistic sense and for the purpose of storytelling, of making sure that their audience fully understands, and they hold their hand a little bit so they fully understand the story, which I think damages it a bit. I think there are a lot of examples of pieces of art, of movies and television episodes that don't do the hand holding, like Undone, that really just, and you do have a lot of audiences complaining, oh, this is confusing, I didn't get it, like David Lynch's work, for example. But it makes it more artistic, in my opinion, and that this episode wasn't really fully willing to take that risk of it, because it would alienate some of the audiences, and it wasn't willing to do that, which I actually hold it against it. Maybe that's unfair of me, but you know, that's how I see it. So I do appreciate the artistic way in which this episode was created, and I do appreciate the work and the research that went behind it, but it still didn't go far enough to me. And so I do think it's a good episode, a decent episode. And here's the thing that bothered me the most when I first watched season 4, and the reason why I skipped over this episode, and I didn't care, is because it is kind of taking a time out to get Beatrice's backstory when the focus should be on Bojack and Hollyhock. And that's the main reason why I skipped it. Whereas unlike like Fish Out of Water, I skipped it because I didn't want to watch it and I thought it was boring and horrible. And same with the Sugarman Place thing. With this, it wasn't so much of that as more of I wanted to see what happened to Hollyhock. I didn't care about Beatrice's background. So I think that's another sort of strike against it. It does like bring the story to a halt to tell this backstory, which personally to me is not as interesting. Now, as I said in more recent times, I found it a bit more interesting because I get the point they're hammering home about how the cycle of abuse is handed down through generations, and so that's what got me to appreciate this episode more than I did before. But and of course you get the revelation that Bojack isn't Hollyhock's father, but Bojack is actually her half brother because it was his father, Crackerjack, who fathered Hollyhock with Henrietta. And I love they actually dropped hints of that earlier in the season, which is great going back and watch that because Beatrice calls Bojack, who she's referring to as Henrietta this whole entire time, as a waste of my husband's sperm. And Bojack's like, oh, so you do know who I am, because she thinks she's referring to sperm of him being born, but she's actually talking about her husband sleeping with Henrietta. Which subtle hints like that. Like, I think that's cool. That's part of the reason why I love this show so much. So I did think that was somewhat interesting, but I don't like that reveal, to be perfectly honest. I think it kind of cheapened the whole Hollyhock storyline. I think it would have been better if Bojack was actually Hollyhock's father and not just her brother. And they try to justify this towards the end of the season, saying, oh, I have 8 dads, I don't need another dad, but I do need a brother. Oh, doesn't that make it all better? I don't know. It's just less interesting of a storyline to me if it's not his daughter and it's just his half-sister, but whatever. One more thing about this episode I feel I absolutely have to mention is that at the end, when Bojack goes to Beatrice and she finally recognizes him, and he has this touching moment where he's like, where she's like, oh, where am I? And he's like, oh, you're back in the lake house of Michigan. Do you smell that? There's Crackerjack playing piano and the ice cream. Can you taste it? And she's like, it tastes delicious. Now, I've heard a lot of people refer to this recently when I was watching reviews and whatnot as like a great cathartic moment for Bojack is when he's finally willing to let go of his hate for Beatrice and how well earned it was that he's moving beyond this. And I very strongly disagree with that. I'm sorry, but I do. In fact, when I first saw this and when I saw it the second time and the third time, I feel every time I see this, I feel like this is not earned. And that she doesn't deserve it. And again, maybe, way too bitter towards Beatrice. But I don't think this is earned. It seemed to come out of nowhere. I mean, because we, the audience, got her backstory. We know that she had a very abusive childhood and a lot of horrible shit was done to her. But what's changed for Bojack? Why did he change all of a sudden? Just because she recognized him, that he was able to be like, oh, you're back in Michigan. I think he's being too nice. I think he's being a sucker, if I'm going to be honest, by giving in to her. Honestly, I'm kind of with him with leave her at the worst available room that's overlooking the dumpster and fuck her and leave her to die. I don't know why I feel so strongly about this. Maybe people think I'm being too cruel or whatever, but I think he's a sucker for giving in to her, and I don't think she deserves this kind of peace. That's just me, but I didn't like the scene. I didn't like it at all. And I don't think it was earned. I think it was the opposite of earned. It came out of nowhere. It was not earned in the least. Maybe I'm being unfair. So anyway, yeah. So it's a decent episode. I kind of get why people love it so much. I just don't. I'm sorry. Anyway, we'll get into the next episode, which is, what time is it right now? And so this is when they go to the "what time is it right now" thing to pitch to Filbert. And Princess Caroline doubles down on her lie that Bojack is attached to it. And then she feels really guilty about it, and she realizes it could ruin her entire career, and she goes to Bojack. But at this point, Bojack is so defeated that he's like, yeah, sure, I'll do it, whatever. I'll do whatever you want. And it's funny because when he starts reading the script, after he's already agreed to it, he's like, oh my God, what is this garbage I agreed to? which I like. And again, you get glimpses of Bojack being a good person, where he realizes all the shit Princess Caroline's done for him throughout his life, which was a lot. And he's willing to be like, yeah, I owe you one. I'll do it for you. Like, that's, yeah. So that's why I would argue that Bojack is not completely worthless. That yes, there's a lot of shit he does, which he does actually deserve to face consequences for, but he's not overall a terrible person, the way Beatrice is. Sorry. I'm sorry. That's just the way I very strongly feel. But anyway, so yeah, they also get the where Bojack realizes that he's Hollyhock's brother and not sister. And I think it was kind of silly the way they revealed this with the Simpson DNA when he's watching the old episode of Horsing Around and talking about O.J. Simpson's lawyer saying, well, that DNA doesn't have to be O.J. Simpson's DNA. It could be any Simpson DNA. And he's like, wait a second. And they even joke about how how main characters have stupid revelations over nothing, and he's like, oh, I hate shows like that, and then Bojack does the exact same thing. They kind of played that joke earlier in the first episode of the season with Mr. Peanut Butter's talking about how people are oblivious to something great happening behind them, and it was actually happening at the same time. So, I don't know. I feel like they already did that joke. But, yeah, I did like the whole thing of Bojack doing all. And again, this is showing what a great person he is that he goes out of his way, does all this work to find out who Hollyhock's mother is, and he doesn't even want credit for it. He just wants her to know. But then she does find out because she could understand her dad's secret language, and she does realize that Bojack went out of this trouble for her. And then she's on her way to meet up with her real mother, and she thanks him and says that they could have a relationship as brother and sister. So that actually was a touching ending that I did actually really appreciate. But again, you have this bullshit with Todd and this clown dentist, which I really hated. But thankfully that didn't take up too much time in this episode. So I do think this that was a really good episode. Alright, so now's the time where I get into the best episode and the worst episode of the season, or should I say my favorite or least favorite, of course, all depending on my opinion. Anyway, as for the worst episode of the season, the Old Sugarman Place is the runner-up, so you can be slightly mad, but at least I'm not saying it's the worst episode of the season. It is my runner-up. But the worst episode of the season, I'm going to have to go with See Mr. Peanut Butter Run. Maybe I'm holding against this episode more because it was the first episode of the season, but I really don't think this episode works. I think it's too ridiculous, too over the top. The Todd shenanigans really pissed me off, and the joke with Mr. Peanut Butter being like so outrageously stupid, and that stupid ski instructor like this. I'm sorry, this is the worst way to start the season they could have possibly come up with. Anyway, getting into the best episode of season 4, there are actually a lot of really good episodes. There's Commence Fracking, Stupid Piece of Shit, Loving That Kelly Lifestyle. But to me, it comes down to 2 episodes, which is actually very hard to choose between the 2. But I'm going to have to go with the runner-up as being What Time Is It Right Now? And the best episode of season 4 being Thoughts and Prayers. Mainly for the Bojack storyline where he goes into the nursing home. and they had, to me, which is probably the best joke of the entire show, where he's like, I take her hand, look her in the eye, and say, fuck you! But it's so good because it has an element of truth to it. Like, you can it shows how damaged Bojack is and how resentful he is to her mother, that even when she's suffering through this horrible disease, that he still has not an ounce of sympathy for her. And again, as I explained, I completely understand his point of view. In fact, I think he's justified in it. But from Hollyhock's perspective, who doesn't understand his backstory, sees it as kind of appalling. So it's great the way that we play off on it. And of course, I also like the storyline with the thoughts and prayers, sort of making satire about gun violence and how it affects Hollywood, and how people in Hollywood and just people in general can be all stuck up. And I think, oh my God, this gun violence really affects me. My movie won't get made, where people actually died and lost their lives and suffered through this horrible, horrible incident, and they're acting like their lives are damaged just because their stupid movie didn't get made. So overall, yeah, I thought this was a really great episode. So, into my rating for Season 4 as a whole. My rating for Season 4 out of 10, I'm going to give this a 7. Very good. Now, 7 is not a bad rating. It's still a good rating. It's more like averagely good. Like, it's like nothing special, but still good and decent to watch, which is pretty much what I think of Season 4, which I do believe will be the lowest rating I will give to a season so far. I believe I gave Season 1 and 3 a 9, and Season 2 a 10, and from memory, I'm pretty sure I'll give Season 5 and 6 also 9 or 10s. So this is clearly the lowest, but still good rating. As I said, the 7 is not a terrible rating. It's still positive. Because, yeah, I mean, a lot of episodes in this season I just thought were decent, and they had some terrible storylines, such as the Todd clown dentist thing, or the house falling under thing, or Mr. Peanut Butter running for governor. I just too many stuff that I didn't think was done very well, and I think some pretentiousness handling in Beatrice's backstory that I wasn't a fan of either. I did really like the Hollyhocks thing. As I said, there's some positive this season, and I liked a lot of the character interactions. I do like the statement they hold on how generations, miseries passed down from generations, and how this has effect on people, and sort of just making the statement, showing the backstory, and leaving it up to the viewer to decide whether or not it's justified or not, which I really like. I think that is the kind of really smart, intelligent storytelling that really pushes this show above the other animated shows, which is why I still say Bojack Horseman is the singular best animated comedy show of all time. But that being said, probably the weakest season of the show. Anyway, that is it for my review of Bojack Horseman Season 4. I shall be back in a month for my review of Season 5. Now, I have done an actual review of Season 5 when it first came out, but this video will be an episode-by-episode review, which I didn't quite do, and it will be a new perspective after a year of watching it, so it's still different than the other one, so I'm still going to do it. Anyway, thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to leave a like, and you can subscribe to check out many more videos I do on other shows like Star Trek, The Expanse, and more. So be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that. And thanks a lot for watching.